Shalom. Let me get straight into this lesson. This is the beloved elder Matazakba. You know what I'm saying? Going into, our people in a lost state of mind. They mentally ill. And this mental illness is very, very deep and ingrained inside of our people. I'm gonna get into this video. This should play a few seconds of it, Salakia. And I'm gonna get into this lesson. But we kind of, go over the same thing over and over sometimes. Because it's new brothers and sisters waking up and they have to be, you know, told about this and be edified. So I'm gonna get into this video. I'm gonna play a few seconds of it and then I'm gonna show you something.
Yeah, you read the title right, but let's talk about it though.
Back
So
it
this
up.
movement started. Yeah, you read the title right, but let's talk about it though. So this movement started in the late 1800s, formed among slaves who were looking for a sense of identity, dignity, and belonging. Figures such as Frank Terry, William Saunders Crowdy taught that African Americans are descendants of the ancient Israelites, reclaiming biblical identity as a counter to white Christian supremacy. To the Hebrew Israelites that mind their business, worship their God in all spirit and truth, that kill the flesh daily, that commune with God daily, that love their brethren, I'm not talking to you, so you can sit down for a while. Talking to the Hebrew Israelites that have founded an entire religious ideology on racism.
You hear that? Did you hear that? I'm gonna back it up one more time. And they're gonna show you Jakes are fucking mentally ill. You know what I'm saying? This is why this adds to the vexation of what we go through. We gotta suffer you ninjas. And it's vexing. We'll be glad when it's over with because we gotta suffer your stupidity. And you ninjas that's outside of the truth, you are fucking stupid. Beyond belief. The goddamn rat got more intelligent than these ninjas in the world. Back this up.
I'm not talking to you, so you can sit down for a while. Talking to the Hebrew Israelites that have founded an entire religious ideology on racism. Black, Hispanic, and Native American.
You heard that? Ain't this some crazy? It's like the Twilight Zone, right? You know what I'm saying? Matter of fact, let me get into that definition. Give me 1 second. All right, so I got this definition, Twilight Zone, at the very top, Collins Dictionary. It says number one, a state of mind between reality and fantasy. I'll read that again, a state of mind between reality and fantasy. So it's feel like, when we hear our people, you know, bring these pressure points that they've been taught by the enemy. And actually, this is so ironic because Christianity was built on racism, but our people have no fault. They don't have no grief. They don't cry about that. But what they find fault is when we say we the Israelites, which we are, and tell them that, we're just not so-called black people, so-called Hispanic and Native Americans and all these bywords. We actually come from a true ethnicity and we Yahweh chosen people. Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shah. That makes our people cringe because they sick, they mentally ill. And she made that claim. I got to play it back one more time so you can get it. Then I'm going to get into this lesson. Give me 1 second. And you ask her ethnicity, and she'll say she's black, but her skin is visibly brown. Let's go to show you this. And play this again.
Mind their business, worship their God in all spirit and truth, that kill the flesh daily, that commune with God daily, that love their brethren. I'm not talking to you, so you can sit down for a while. Talking to the Hebrew Israelites that have founded an entire religious ideology on racism.
Founded an entire religious ideology on racism. Let's get into it. Ain't that some shit, right? Boy, our people, boy, they, you know what I'm saying, they'll vex you out to your spirit. So let's get into this chat GPT. And I'm gonna get into these. She said, was not is not modern day Christianity founded on racism? We're gonna go there. It says the transatlantic slave trade. It says European Christians, which would be Edomites, so-called white people that's they call today, reinterpret the Bible to justify enslaving Africans. Is that not racism? And these are Israelites. We're not Africans. Africans is a Latin word. It's new speak to distort the truth and cause confusion and to set a narrative. The next one is they use distorted readings like the curse of Ham, which that's a very popular doctrine among these different tentacles of modern day Christianity. claiming that so-called Africans were cursed to servitude. The next one, it says churches bless slave ships. Missionaries helped colonizers, and theology was twisted to argue that Israelites, so-called black people, were less human. Is that not racism? Next one, it says by this point, Christianity was no longer just about faith, it was a racial project. Next one, it says to be so-called white and Christian was to be superior, to be so-called African, indigenous, or a non-Christian was to be destined for slavery or extermination. Is that not racism? We don't see that same energy because our people under some called Stockholm syndrome. And get into that, and this is this post-traumatic slave syndrome. Get into that as well. It says enlightenment and scientific racism, 17th through the 19th centuries. So-called Europe. Remember the word Europe is Newspeak as well. They created that word. They actually go to a Phoenician goddess, right? So it's all folly. They call people European. They're Edomites. But I know a lot of you Jakes don't want to say that because of your ignorance and your unwillingness to change out of your brainwashed mind. It says so-called Europe began to develop pseudo-scientific racial theories, ranking so-called white people as superior. And a lot of you so-called white people that goes back into the lineage of Edom, you think this way. Give a damn what you say. It says Christianity blended with these racial ideologies. So-called whiteness was equated with godliness, blackness with sin or savagery. That's why we tell you, Jakes, over and over and over and over again to stop using those fake ethnicities. It says missionaries went with colonizers to so-called Africa, Asia, and the Americas, preaching a racialized gospel that demanded assimilation and subjugation. Is that not racism? It says so-called churches in so-called Europe and so in the so-called Americas were deeply involved in the slave trade. Do you hear this? Segregation and colonization. Slovakia. It says how so-called European Christianity was founded on racism. When Christianity entered so-called Europe, it became a tool of Empire Rome medieval Christendom. It says two, a racial project defining Europeans, Edomites, as chosen and others as cursed. It says three, a justification for slavery and colonialization through papal bulls. The slave trade and the doctrine of discovery. It says four, a cultural weapon, missionary erasing so-called African Israelites, indigenous, and Asian identities under the banner of saving souls. Now you Jakes repeat these things because it's embedded inside your DNA. All this trauma. Let's go here. It says European rulers and churches created formal and legal theological cover for conquest and forced conversion to be Christians. Papal bulls and the later doctrine of discovery gave so-called Christian monarchs the authority to take non-Christian lands and peoples in practice in Salakia. In practice, this was used to justify enslavement, depossession, and forced missionary activity. These documents were foundational to how colonizers thought they could treat indigenous peoples. Indigenous mean people that was already in a land. It says why that mattered. When Crown, Church, and law all endorsed conquest as a righteous mission, it normalized violence and made forced conversion a policy rather than a fringe abuse. Is that not racism? Let's keep going. You ninjas are sick. Direct military conquest, terror, and mass killing. Conquest campaigns, Spanish campaigns in Mexico, them are Israelites as well, and Peru, them are Israelites as well. Combined battlefield slaughter, massacres of non-combatants, and terror tactics to break communities. After military defeat, conquistadors often forced baptism, executed leaders who resisted, and installed a clergy to oversee conversion. It says eyewitnesses, complaints, and exposes most famous Bartholomew, whatever, record brutal massacres, forced baptisms at the sword, and a systematic abuses during the early colonial period. Is that not racism? Stupid ninjas outside the truth. How it worked on ground. Raid a town, kill or enslave many, force survivors into baptism, and that's when they convert them over to be Christians to see the bow downs of the image of so-called white Jesus as they do today, install a garrison and priests, and require attendance at mass under the penalty of labor, taxes, or worse, death, right? Kidnapping and assimilation of children, boarding schools removals, a powerful method of forcing cultural and religious change was removing children from families and placing them in mission schools, boarding institutions, or government homes run by churches. In contexts like Australia, removal laws and mission reserve systems were especially used to assimilate children, the stolen generations, severing languages, families, and spiritual transmissions. Similar patterns occurred in North America and elsewhere through Indian boarding schools and a mission-run orphanages. The institutions trained children into Christianity and European norms and often forbade native languages and practices. Is that not racism? It says colonial administrations wrote laws that criminalized indigenous spiritual practices, often under labels of idolatry or sorcery, transferred land titles away, right, and made baptized indigenous people subject to Spanish or British colonial control in new ways. These Edomites, all the same. Those laws made a few those laws made refusal to convert not merely a spiritual decision, but an act with legal penalties, loss of land, loss of status, and loss of life. The doctrine of discovery shaped later legal rulings and property law in the Americas. Is that not racism? Let me see, because I want to hit some more stuff. I think that's pretty much the bulk of what I want to get into in the chat GPT. So let's go here to this right here. This post-traumatic slave syndrome is described as intergenerational trauma experienced by so-called Africans, you Israelites, as a result of slavery and its ongoing effects. It says this trauma can be passed down through generations, impacting mental health. Our people are mentally ill. They're out of their mind. They sick in the head. They got something called Stockholm syndrome. Look at this. Stockholm syndrome is a psychological coping mechanism that can develop in victims of captivity or abuse, causing them to identify with and develop positive feelings towards their captors. It's sick in the head, mentally ill. And this is the tradition, the generational curses that has been passed on through our people, through their genetics, damn near. That's how deep it is. That they would overlook the oppressive wickedness, all the things that they've done, ignore the history, and come after us as we the bad guys. We never did any of these things to so-called white people, and they're going to show you how people are sick in the head, fucking mentally ill. Excuse my language. But look, this is why we do these lessons. That's why we show this passion, and we're gonna continue to push, because we gotta wake the elect up out of this mental bondage. Hopefully, this lesson was edifying. Call Hala Yahweh, Bahashim Yahushua, Bahashim Rachat Kodash. Shalom.